Nothing better than the love of God. Thank you, Nick. Well, a question for you here. Do we have any fans of good crime thriller novels? John Grisham, little old school Agatha Christie. Yeah, there we go. Oh, a lot of hands went up on that one. I'm one of those. One of my favorite fictional characters is a Los Angeles detective named Harry Bosch. Any Harry Bosch fans? A couple? All right, yeah, there we go. He was invented by an author named Michael Connelly, who's one of my favorites. And so I have been looking forward to this morning's speaker all summer long. I'm not sure if he really goes in for the comparison, but I've got visions kind of a real-life Harry Bosch right here in Ocean City this morning. But J. Warner Wallace, he began his law enforcement career in Los Angeles, serving on the SWAT team, the gang detail, robbery homicide unit, don't mess with him. He went on to become a cold case homicide detective, and his work on high-profile cases across the country earned him several awards, numerous national television appearances, lots of appearances on Dateline NBC. You may have seen him on there. He also started off as an atheist. But along the way, he decided to apply the investigative techniques of his profession to the claims of Christianity and to the Bible. And so when the case was closed, J. Warner Wallace was a Christian. And while continuing to consult as a cold case investigator, he's also earned a master's degree in theology, served as a pastor at Saddleback Church, been a faculty member at Biola University. He's authored several books, Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith. You can find them out on the table out there. And he's a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. So, if you've got skeletons in the closet or bodies in the backyard, this is not your day. But if you would like to be challenged and motivated to find and share the evidence that makes our faith so compelling, you're in exactly the right place this morning. So would you please help me welcome J. Warner Wallace.
Okay. Good morning. I tell you, I get the question a lot in my work. It's been fun to work homicides, but if you think about it, every point of entry, every starting point when you're working a homicide is somebody else's point of tragedy. And so you don't even begin to do your work until everybody else has had a bad day. And I get this question a lot, why in all these cases that we work, and if you watch Dateline, you've seen some of them, why did this thing happen to our family? Why did this happen to my daughter? Why did this happen to my kids, my spouse? I get this question a lot. And it was a question for me that I don't think that was never a stumbling point for me as a non-believer. I just thought it was silly to think that there was a God. But it was never because of tragedy that I thought there was no God. But I understand the power of the question now. And I have seen families who have suffered the loss of a young person in their family or a loved one who they were very committed Christians until the crime occurred. And then they could not reconcile how an all-powerful, all-loving God would allow this to happen. And they struggled for years with it. Some of them, after we do our work, they are able to kind of return. Some don't. My son is now struggling with the same kinds of questions, right? Because he's doing the same work. He has to answer these kinds of questions for others. He was raised in the church because I became a Christian when he was about 8. So he doesn't remember really a time before I was a believer. But he still gets these questions, and now he has to answer them. He's using the same skill set and tool set that I used before him because he learned it from me. He has my name. His name is also Jim Wallace. We're not very creative when it comes to names. We use the same ones. I'd like to say that we're the George Foreman of law enforcement, okay? If you know who George Foreman is, he's got 5 or 6 boys, and they're all named cleverly George Foreman. So we do the same thing. And my dad's got different answers to these questions because he's not a believer. So his answer would be different. His name is also Jim Wallace. I was born in my dad's academy. My son was born in my academy. So we've had 3 generations. For the last 57 years, we've been trying to answer this question for people. I want to talk to you this morning about the problem of evil and how we could answer it, because for a lot of people, even in your lives, you know somebody who probably has some complaint against God, some reason why they're shaking their fists, something that is keeping them from the truth, that is probably grounded in this question: why would God allow that to happen? Now, we're going to do it by taking a look at what I call Death Investigations 101. And I'm going to keep it very simple because I want to talk to you really about the problem of evil. The first service, we did a completely different talk, but I want to kind of introduce a concept, and that is this simple concept. Whenever we find someone dead in a room, we have to figure out how to solve it. So how do I know what happened to this guy? Well, there are only 4 things, if he's dead, that could have happened to him. There are only 4 ways to die. You either die by some accidental cause, some natural cause, by suicide, or by homicide. I got to try to figure out when I get there, is homicide in the mix? Now, clearly, if you look at this guy, he's got a single gunshot wound. He's got a note laying next to his body. He's got a gun laying next to his body. So I'm guessing I can take natural off the wall, right? But I still have these 3 to choose from. And which of these 3 is the most reasonable explanation? Well, how I get to the answer is by playing a little game I call inside or outside the room. And we're going to do that real quickly here. So let's pretend we got a room around this guy. Let's make it visual. Put him in a box. So now he's in the box, and the question is, can I explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room? If I can explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room, this is probably not a murder. Let me show you what I mean. So let's go and just take this approach. We're going to try to stay inside the room. Okay, well, he's got he's clearly dead, and he's got a note laying next to him. But that note is written in his own handwriting on paper I find elsewhere in the room. It's his own pen. It's only got his fingerprints on it. It's only got his skin cell transfer DNA on it. Everything comes back to him. And I can find more paper like that right inside the room. I can actually explain this by just accounting it to him inside the room, right? And if someone tells me that's his pistol, he's owned that for years, keeps it in a safe in the corner of the room, it's registered to him, it's only got his skin cell transfer on it. Okay, great. So now I can even explain the gun by staying inside the room. And anyone can shoot themselves once without any help from anyone else outside the room. So I can even explain this single gunshot wound by staying inside the room for an answer. He did it. If this is the case, and I can explain everything in the room by staying in the room, it's going to be one of those 2, accidental or suicide. But what if the best explanation is not inside the room? What if the best explanation is outside the room? That would change things. What if I examine that note and I discover it's not his handwriting? It's not on his paper. It doesn't have his fingerprints on it. It's an unknown set of fingerprints. It's not his skin cell transfer. It's somebody else I don't know who doesn't even live there. Well, now I got to look outside the room for an explanation for the note. And let's say he's got not 1 gunshot wound, but multiple gunshot wounds. There's a pistol laying there, but the pistol's not his. I talked to his family. He's afraid of guns. He would never own a gun. That's not his gun. And sure enough, the serial number's been scratched off, and it doesn't have his skin cell on it. It's not his. I got to figure out whose gun that is. And it's kind of hard to shoot yourself multiple times, right? Unless you've got a really high tolerance for pain, right? And you're very selective about your placement of rounds. Other than that, this is kind of hard to accomplish. So a better explanation is somebody outside the room to explain the multiple gunshots. And I've even got bloody footprints now in this one that lead outside the room. So clearly those bloody footprints are best explained by a cause outside the room. Do you see what just happened? Everything has to shift now to homicide. Why? Because the best explanation for what's in the room is now outside the room. I've got good evidence of an intruder. And intruders change everything. Well, I started thinking as an atheist years ago, could I apply this technique to the question of God's existence? What if the room we were talking about is not a scene of a death, but is instead the entire natural universe? Can I explain everything that's in the universe by staying inside the room for an answer? All I can work with is space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Can I get everything that I see in the room with just space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Now, there's stuff in the room that has to be explained. And we're going to just play this game of insight. I think the biggest problem you have, and this is what you start with, you've got to explain how the room got there. The room has a beginning. All science tells us that all space, time, and matter had a beginning. This is the standard cosmological model. And the beginning, it came from nothing. That's right, at a point in the past, all space, time, and matter leapt into existence from nothing according to the science. And when I say nothing, I don't mean there was space. No, space is something. There was no space, time or matter. You might say, well, what does it mean by nothing? It's what Aristotle says rocks think about, dream about. Nothing. Okay? So the problem you have is that if whatever it is that caused all space, time, and matter to leap into existence has itself to be non-spatial, non-temporal, and non-material. Those things didn't exist before the beginning of the universe. So what are we looking for? Something that's all-powerful, that's already outside the box. It's already outside the room of the natural universe. Not only that, the universe we happen to live in is extremely fine-tuned for the appearance of carbon-based life like ours. In other words, all of the cosmological constants, from weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force, electromagnetism, gravity, even the placement of and how gravity affects the physical objects in the universe is so finely tuned that the smallest variation and life will not emerge in the universe. The universe won't even be able to sustain itself. Why is it so fine-tuned? We also know that life emerges from non-life. We talked about that in the last service. I'm doing 2 different talks today. So you can maybe catch that online. But the idea here is we know that everything in the universe is living. It was at one time there was no life in the universe, and now there is. How do we explain that? And why does this life appear to be designed? Not only that, you're thinking about this right now. You are using your mind, not just your brain. You have consciousness. How do you explain consciousness, this immaterial reality, if the universe is entirely material? It's an only physical. According to atheism, it's called physicalism. How do I can get brains from physicalism, but how do I get minds? Maybe we don't have a mind. But if you don't have a mind, you don't have the freedom to make choices, because that means your physical thing, this brain you have, is just like dominoes that fall. You have neurons that fire, and they're just caused by prior neurons that fire, and you have no control over any of that because you don't have any conscious control, because you don't have a conscious to begin with. So atheists who are very, very committed to their worldview, like Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist who's also an atheist philosopher, he denies mind, he denies free agency. These are illusions. Yet you think you're thinking about this, don't you? So this is really, it runs against our all common experience of agency, of free agency, and of mind. We got to explain it somehow. Also, there are some things that are just not okay regardless of who you are. It's never okay to torture babies for fun. I'm sorry, it never will be, never has been. I don't care where you are in history or where you are on the planet. These overarching moral obligations and laws have to have a source. And today what we're going to talk about is the last thing. All of us have a duty to explain evil. It turns out that these things have some source, some explanation. The question is, can you explain these things with nothing more than space, time, or matter, or is the best explanation outside the room? That's what I want to talk about. If the best explanation is outside the room, then we have an intruder. But it's not an intruder like in your house. This spans the entire cosmos, which is why I wrote a book called God's Crime Scene. My publisher hated this title. They said, Jim, you got to change this title. It sounds like you're saying that God committed a crime. No, I'm not saying God committed a crime. I'm saying you could examine the universe like a crime scene to see what the best explanation is. Now, we did the last service. We did just the talk about the origin of life. But I want to go back and show you the overarching case. There it is. I want to talk today just about the problem of evil. Now, what I'm about to tell you, for some of you who have already experienced evil, will have little or no power. If evil is in your rearview mirror, sometimes all I can do is just stand with you and walk with you through the tragedy. My explanations from a rational perspective will not have the kind of impact you're hoping for, because you're not experiencing something rational right now. It's deeply emotional. But for those of you who say, no, I haven't quite experienced that evil yet, that's still not my rearview mirror, that's still through my windshield. If it's still downfield for you, what I'm about to tell you, I think will help inoculate your emotional state when you do experience evil. But just know this right now. I know that for some of you who have experienced horrific evil, what I'm about to say may seem even trivial. But I think we have to address the issue regardless. Now, here's a picture of my dad back in the 1970s. He was working a case. This is my dad over here on the far right. He hates that picture because he looks so ridiculously terrible in that picture. First of all, he's got a 1970s mustache. You know, I'll just tell you right now, nobody wears just a mustache. Those days are over. Either you've got a beard, a goatee, or you have no facial hair, but nobody wears just a mustache anymore, okay? I will prove it to you. If you have just a mustache, raise your hand. Seriously, raise your hand. Take a look. All old guys. You don't have any facial hair. You have a full goatee because you get it, okay? The rest of you guys need to shave that sucker off, okay? That looks terrible. This guy confessed to killing a girl in our city. This is the guy in the middle. He confessed to killing a girl in our city. It's a terrific, just a terrible crime, and it's horrific. And he confessed to all of it, about a 1,000-page transcript, everything he did to her, how he finally killed her. None of it is true. He's not our killer. He's got problems, but he's not our killer. He got more attention from this detective right here than he'd ever had in his entire life, so he was willing to tell her anything. This case was open until about 3 months ago, and finally we solved it with Ancestry DNA. It's becoming quite popular, as you know. So for all of you who are submitting your DNA to Ancestry databases, I want to thank you in advance, okay? Because you're making it possible for us to arrest your family members. I really appreciate that. Ours hit to his daughter, and we got the killer's daughter, so we knew who he was. The question is, why would this happen to Jackie? Why would this girl suffer this fate? I can only imagine what her last 2 hours must have been like. Why would an all-powerful, all-loving God? And I was asked this question by her family members. Why did this happen to my daughter? Well, really, you want an answer? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a little bit complex. It's going to involve a number of things that have a causal relationship to one another. This is how we work cases. I'll tell you this. If Jackie isn't the kind of girl who would get in a car with a stranger, this wouldn't happen, which is why, young people, we tell you not to get in the cars with strangers. If she wasn't that kind of girl, this would not happen. That's the first domino that had to fall. But also, I can tell you that if it wasn't a holiday on the day of the crime, this wouldn't have happened because her family said, kids, get out of the house. We're making dinner. We can't have you in the house until we're done. Just spend a couple hours out there, and then we'll come back when we're done. We'll tell you when to come back in the house. So they weren't really paying attention to her. If they weren't paying attention to her, if they were rather, and she wasn't the kind of kid who gets in a car like this doesn't happen. And the person who did this, I guarantee you, had a disturbing upbringing. People I have worked who do these kinds of things typically have had a disturbing upbringing of their own. If he isn't the kind of guy who has suffered that kind of upbringing, she isn't the kind of person who gets in a car and this isn't a holiday, this doesn't happen. It's a weird part of our neighborhood, too. It's very, very tucked away. It's not on a major. He had to know how to get in and get out of that neighborhood. So somehow he had familiarity with this weird corner of our city. If he doesn't have that kind of familiarity, doesn't have that kind of upbringing, she doesn't get in a car and it's not a holiday, this doesn't happen. He had to have the right kind of car. Without that car, this doesn't happen. He had to have the right kind of timing. Without that kind of timing, do you see what's happening here? This is a series of factors that have to be considered. And I can't even tell you sometimes what the causal relationships are between these factors. But if I'm going to solve this case to determine why this happened to that girl, I'm going to have to unpuzzle the puzzle and figure out how these things are related to each other so that any act of evil would occur. This is what detectives do. Now I'll go back to our evidence for God's existence. I think that the 7 pieces of evidence that we aren't talking about today, which ought to demonstrate, I teach this class at Biola, it takes me 17 hours to teach the class. I could force you to stay here for all 17 hours and just teach the class, but I'm not going to do that. Therefore, there is a God, so I've already proven to you that God exists, right? So that's done. Now the question is, if these things point to God, and I think they do. These cannot be explained from inside the room. These point to a cause outside the room. Anything that points to your suspect is called inculpating evidence. But now we have this 8th thing, evil. Now that's different. Some people would say, I don't care how good your first 7 things are. You could have great pieces of evidence that point to your suspect, but if he tells you he was not even in the country on the day of the murder, then he's got an alibi. If that alibi checks out, you're done. I don't care how good he looks on paper. He can't be your guy. He's got an alibi. Is that what evil is? Is evil the thing that disqualifies God as an explanation? Because an all-powerful, all-loving God would not allow this kind of thing to happen. In other words, evidence that points away from your suspect is not inculpating, it's exculpating. Is evil exculpating evidence that proves that God cannot be the explanation for everything else? That's what I want to talk to you about. Epicurus is accredited with this statement, which is very ancient. Here's his complaint against God. He says, if God is willing to prevent evil, Is God willing to and then not able? Well, then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Let me give it to you in English. Is God powerful enough to do this? But he can't? Well, he's not powerful if he can't stop it. Is he just unwilling to stop it? I mean, he could stop it. He's powerful enough, but he doesn't really want to stop it. Then stop calling him all-loving. If you're saying he's all-loving and all-powerful, he should not only have the ability to stop it, he should want to stop it. If you knew what happened to Jackie, you can't imagine why God wouldn't want to stop it. So what's the answer? I can tell you this, I've got to puzzle it the same way I puzzle the murder. I can think of 7 reasons why God would allow that horrific thing to happen, starting with the role eternity plays, starting with a really proper understanding of the power of free agency and the definition of love and the power that this kind of thing has to develop character and draw us to him. And I can think of a number of reasons why God. Now look, I can't tell you which of these is foremost in God's mind. I can't. But I can think of several reasons why an all-powerful, all-loving God might allow something horrific to happen to you, to me. It's going to be in this combination of causes, all of which have to be considered when accounting for evil. Let me just jump right in. We have to have a proper view of eternity. Here's what I mean by that. As an atheist, I would have told you that I saw life as a line segment. It begins at birth. It runs 90 pain-free, joyous years and ends peacefully in my sleep at the age of 90. That was my hope. That's probably the hope of all of you, right? Like, we're going to have this great thing. You're going to run a half marathon in the last day of your life at 90, set a world record for 90-year-olds running half marathons, and then you're going to drop dead in your sleep and it's going to be painless. Wouldn't that be awesome? And you're going to get rich along the way, have a great life and great kids who will never get in trouble, never give you any grief. Really? Yeah. So that's the point, though. That's the hope, right? That was my hope. Now look, if I'd have gotten sick with cancer, say at the age of 40, and then suffered miserably for 10 years and died at the age of 50, I would have seen that as evil. Why? Well, because I had an expectation that I wanted to get those years that I'm now lost. But what if I'm wrong about my foundational view of what life is? What if I'm wrong and life is not a line segment? What if life is instead a ray that begins at birth, runs through this thing we call death, and then goes off infinitely in this direction? That's what rays are. They start at a point, go through another point, and they go off indefinitely in the other direction. Make sense? If that is the true definition of what life is, I think everything has to change. And how I see evil. Look, some of you in this room, you raise your hand if you're one of these people, there's always somebody who maybe at birth you had some kind of abnormality, something that had to be corrected surgically. And in the first 2 or 3 weeks, you had a very serious operation to save your life. Could you raise your hand if you're in that group? So you know what I'm talking about. If I would have stopped your life in the first 2 weeks while you're having those surgeries, says, how's life going for you? You'd say it stinks. It's painful. I see no good in this. Why even have me here if it's going to be like this? But by the time you were 3 after that surgery, you don't ever remember having the surgery. Your parents told you about it. Well, why? Because evil, as you see it, the pain you suffer, is measured in the context of this thing we call our life. And 60 years into your life, whatever you suffered in the first 6 months, you're already over it. Does that make sense? Evil is always measured in the context of the span of our lives. Well, wait a minute. What if our view of life is not a line segment, but it's a ray? What that means is that every year you spend in eternity, the length of your temporal mortal life seems smaller and smaller. So as you are 1,000 years in eternity, that 90 years you lived on life seems smaller. If you're 1,000,000 years into eternity, guess what? That life you lived here for 90 years seems really tiny. At some point, your life on earth is simply a millisecond compared to what life really is, which has been you in eternity with God, pain-free. So we have to measure evil in the context of our life, but it turns out our life is not a line segment of 90 years. All of us are born eternal creatures. This is how we have to measure our life, have to measure our pain. This would change everything. Most of the time, we as Christians, we say we believe this, but we live as though we only get 90 years. And it better happen in those 90 years. If not, it's not right. Really? I think eternity changes everything. But I also want you to consider another factor, and that's the powerful role that free agency plays. Think about it. If there's a loving God, and he's going to create a planet, is he going to create a planet where love is possible or where love is impossible? Which of these two options do you think a loving God is going to create? I think he's going to create option one. Because if God loves, if God is love, he's going to create a world in which we can love. We are in his image. But if you want a world like that, are you sure you want that kind of world? I don't know. My wife and I, we've been together for 40 years. We got married on Valentine's Day. Let's say that we broke up. And years later, after breaking up, 5 years later, I decided I want to reconvince her of my love for her. So on Valentine's Day, our old anniversary, I send her a Valentine's card. This Valentine's Day card. You will love me. Roses are red, bullets are lead. Take me back now or get shot in the head. I am a wordsmith, I will tell you right now. So here's my card to her. I think it's quite nice. Do you think that's going to work? I could pull a gun out and point at her head and say, you will love me. And she's going to say, I love you. But is that really love? It turns out that in order to have this thing called love, you need a foundation first. That first, if God is loving, he has one priority over love. Because you can't get love without this priority. Here it is. He needs free agency. You have to create a world in which we have the freedom. It's not compelled. Now, you could program that into us. You could program us to be lovers, but then it's not really love. You could call it love, but love it's not real love. Love is a choice we make. But that's a dangerous choice because we have to have the freedom to hate, that means. Without creating, it's logically impossible for God to create a world with love in which there isn't also hate because you have to have that freedom in order for love to be genuine. Does that make sense? So you want that world? That's a dangerous world. Free agency puts danger in everything. Now, listen, I'll tell you, a loving God does not just throw the knife at you and let you figure out how to catch it, by the handle of the blade. No, a loving God gives you this dangerous thing which is foundational before you could ever experience joy, love, all of this. And by the way, without free agency, you cannot rationalize anything. You cannot think. You cannot be rational. You cannot be creative. You cannot love. And you cannot be culpable unless there's this dangerous thing first called free agency. And a loving God is not just going to give you that dangerous thing. He's going to give you that dangerous, beautiful thing called free agency. And he's going to give you an instruction guide so you will not misuse that dangerous, beautiful thing. Now, some of us will ignore the instruction guide. I get that. That's not on God. A loving God gives you the dangerous tool and tells you how to use it. Free agency is a huge part of the explanation for why we see evil in the world. But there's a third thing. You think God's loving. I agree, God is loving. But what do we mean by that definition? What do we mean when we say loving? Do we mean the Hollywood version of love? The kind of cultural version of love? That's all the words we typically think of when you think of love, right? It's this stuff, love and kindness and gentleness and adoration. Okay, if you're a parent in this room, you already know that there's a definition on the wall for love I left off. Right? That's the tough love that all of us have to do. We all do this. We have to do this. I have adult kids now. I have to exercise some tough love. Since they're not live streaming this and we're not recording it, I'll tell you a little story. My oldest daughter decided to go to college about 8 hours from us, and then she decided to drop out of school. And I told her, I said, girl, when you drop out, just know this, that you'll be untethered. Because I can support you while you're in school. But while you're not in school, I would be doing you a disservice to prop you up falsely, thinking that you can actually live on your own. If you can't live on your own, if you want to try to live on your own, I get it, no problem. And she did it for 2 years. I was very proud of her without any help from me. And during those 2 years, at one point her car broke down and she just happened to mention it, of course. And I was so, I just want to, it would be no burden for us to fix the car. It is a burden for her. She can't get it fixed. But I didn't fix it. I wanted to, but I would not help her for me to rush in and rescue her when she's made this choice to be on her own. She has to know, can I do this on my own? So as her loving father, I denied any involvement in this case. I just was not going to deal with it. She called us over the summer. She says, she's enrolled at school again. Eventually she came back to it. She is a completely different person over the last 2 years, a completely different person. I'm so proud of her. I'm not rushing in to pay for her school though right now. We'll see. It's that stuff that all of us do as parents, right? My youngest daughter joined the Marines. And she went to school to her boot camp at Parris Island. Then she went to Lejeune for her SOI. Then she went to Missouri to get trained as a military police. And do you know where they stationed her? 20 minutes from my house at Camp Pendleton. She will be there all 4 years. Do you know what she does every afternoon? She drives home to my house where she sleeps every single night. She's in the Marine Corps. She's sleeping at home every night. I'm about to show her some tough love. And I think C.S. Lewis says this correctly about God. We have to understand the role that God plays in our lives. He said it this way: we want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven. You know, a senile benevolence who, as they like to say, like to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. Okay, that is not God. Let's go back to our timeline for a second here. You know you have parents who basically have been with you during your temporal life. You also have this eternal life. You could say this is your earthly life and your post-earthly life. So your parents have been with you here during this time. There's a good chance that they let you suffer some evil down here. Maybe it's an operation. Maybe it's just me not paying for a car. And why? Because they wanted something good over here. Now, you have an earthly parent that governs your entire earthly and post-earthly life. You have a post-earthly parent called God. Now, God might allow you to suffer something. And you say, well, Jim, yeah, but I've known people who have suffered something and nothing good ever came of it. Well, yeah, stupid. He's not limited to just your earthly life. He might be trying to accomplish something over here. You don't know. He has the entire line to work with. We've got to stop thinking that he has to do it in our lifetime. And by the way, God does not give a lick about your comfort. He's after your character. Why? Because he governs the entire ray called your life. And all good parents aim at the things that are lasting. So all I can aim at is the things that will last you 90 years, but God's aiming at the entire array. Make sense? Now this next explanation I used to think was a lame one as an atheist. You mean to tell me that you think that God would allow us to suffer some of these things because he's trying to develop our character? Can't he do it some other way? This is a ridiculous explanation. But I want you to think about this for a second, because as an atheist, these were the high values that I wanted in my world. As a non-believer, I still found these to be the highest virtues that we see in culture. My dad is not a believer, but he loves these virtues. He's glad to live in a country where these virtues are still available. Really? So if I'm God and I'm going to create these virtues, because I'm sure God thinks these are good virtues too, do you think he just snaps his fingers and we have those things now? No, that's not what happens. Every one of these is a response. A response to something bad. You want danger? You want courage, rather? I'm going to have to face danger. You want compassion? I'm going to have to face some suffering. You want to have forgiveness? Well, then I got to face evil. You want to have self-sacrifice? It requires hardship. You want to be charitable? It requires poverty. Do you see that in order to get those high values, you'd have to design a world that looks like this? And that's exactly what God did. This is why, by the way, I never, ever pray for patience, okay? That's a stupid prayer. Because the minute you pray for patience, what's going to happen? God is going to give you something that you can respond to. No, I don't pray for patience anymore. Lewis puts it this way. To ask that God's love should be content with us as we are is to ask that God should cease to be God. Because he is what he is, his love must, in the nature of things, be impeded and repelled by certain stains in our present character. And because he already loves us, he must labor to make us lovable. You want those character issues in your own life to emerge? It's going to take some labor. It won't feel good. Sometimes the right shape requires a piece of sandpaper. Sometimes it requires a rasp. Also, I think that God can use evil to draw us. Look, when I was a non-believer, I would have said, hey, can't you just do a simple, look, if God wants us, can't he just come out like with a donut? Say, got a good donut here. I like donuts. I'm a police officer. So can't you just offer me something nice? Sweetly reach out to me in a gentle way and say, here I am. Well, really? So the entire time I was a non-believer, there was this letter I could read, but I refused to read it. He could have reached me that way. I mean, I just refused to read it. I was working surveillance for probably 4 years undercover in Los Angeles as a non-believer. And at that time, back in the 90s, I got to tell you, there was so much Christian radio. It was a pain in the rear just trying to avoid it. But I found a way to avoid Christian radio. There were even people in my life I chose to ignore. Yeah, God can use these things to reach you, but if you're going to be a jerk, he can reach you another way. He can call you or he can just push you. And usually he uses tragedy to push us. And that's when we pay attention. Lewis puts it this way. Let me implore the reader to try to believe, if only for the moment, that God, who made these deserving people, may really be right when he thinks that their modest prosperity and the happiness of their children are not enough to make them blessed. That's right. You all think that people who have it all, who are self-made, seldom ever turn to God. They're not blessed. They don't know God. So what does he do? He must make all of that fall from them in the end. And that if they have not learned how to know him, they will be wretched. And therefore he troubles them, warning them in advance of any insufficiency that one day will have to be discovered. The life to themselves and their families stands between them and the recognition of their need. He makes that life less sweet to them. That works for many of us. It has worked. Many of you have a story in this room that that's how you became a believer. Sometimes we just do stupid things, and don't be surprised when you get spanked, okay? Some things aren't really about God's, it's about you just being dumb, right? And this happens all the time. There are 3 forms of justice, and if God is loving, he has to be just. You cannot have love without justice. It's this grace, right? And law. Justice and mercy, they're the same, 2 sides of the same coin. If you just distribute your mercy to everyone, even if they're bad people, you're not being just in the way you're distributing your mercy. Then the people you do distribute mercy to are like, so what? He says that to everybody. You have to have justice or mercy is meaningless. And there are 3 forms of justice that exist in our country and I think are exercised by every parent. One really just looks backwards at things you've done in the past, and it tries to be like retribution for bad things you've done. Now, there is an aspect of our criminal justice system that does this, and there are times you and I as a parent, we've done that. We said, Mia, I'm telling you, I told you to do this 4 times in the past, and again, here we are again at the same place. I'm so mad about what you did yesterday. This is your punishment. We've all done that. There's also an aspect of punishment, though, and justice that is forward thinking, not rear view thinking. It's forward thinking. It's this idea that, look, I'm not even upset anymore about the things you've done in the past. I'm already over it. But here's my concern. My concern is if you continue to do this, you will not have a good life. My concern is no longer about the past. I'm concerned about your future. So I'm going to punish you right now with the future in mind, not the past. That's a different kind of justice. That's called utilitarian justice. And finally, there are times when you just need to pay back somebody for something you've taken or some wrong you have done towards somebody. And these are the 3 forms of justice we see in our country. And I'm convinced that loving parents will always do these 3 things. And while you're suffering the justice of a loving parent, you might think that that parent does not care about you. When in fact, this is just what love demands, justice. Last thing. Sometimes it comes down to us having a very limited understanding and thinking that you, with the limited mind of a human, know everything that God knows. But how could we? Here's what Epicurus said in his complaint. Let's go back to it. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. He's not omnibenevolent. Now, you can see how he's made this complaint. He's saying, hey, he's listed two attributes of God, and he's arguing that you can't have both of these and also have evil. Well, why this is clever is because this is not the definition of the Christian God. It's part of it, but not all of it. The first part he's saying deals with the all-powerful nature of God. The second part of the complaint deals with the all-loving nature of God. But he has cleverly and intentionally left out an important dimension of God's nature, that is God's all-knowing nature. That's nowhere in the complaint. And it turns out that if God knows more than we do, he might do something because we don't know what the goal is yet. And this last part of his nature, I think, explains the first two parts of his nature. Let's go back to our timeline for a second. Okay, so God is all-knowing. So we basically know all this stuff, right? But God knows all of this stuff. There's a big difference between these two things. He knows that if this domino falls right now in 2018 or doesn't fall, he knows what consequence awaits us in 3018. You don't know. Everything is connected. Nothing in history sits in isolation. This is the butterfly effect we talk about, right? And you don't know what that small thing or huge thing that you think you suffered, how that's connected to something else in the future. But God would know that. This is why a French Dominican priest, who I love this quote, this is how he put it. He said, if God would concede me his omnipotence for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make in the world. Yeah, but if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things as they are. That's exactly what happens. We don't have the wisdom of God. These are the 7 things that I think are in the mind of God when he allows anything to happen in the world. And we don't even know, in Jackie's case, for example, which of these things had priority. And we don't know what the interconnected nature was. But I do know the puzzle pieces, even if I may not be able today to reassemble the puzzle. Does that make sense? And knowing the puzzle pieces is half the battle. This all contributes to any act of evil. But before I leave, just let me ask you a question. Why are you calling this evil to begin with? Because you don't like what happened to Jackie? Is evil just a matter of your personal opinion? The guy who did this to her didn't mind it. He disagrees with you. Is evil simply a matter of personal? If it is, guess what? We can eliminate all evil tomorrow. Just change your mind about what you think about Jackie. All evil will go away. But that's not going to work because you know that evil is not a matter of your personal opinion. It's not even a matter of our cultural consensus. Evil requires a standard. We think some things are truly evil, but you can't get true, transcendent evil unless there is a true, transcendent standard of good by which you are measuring something. And Lewis knew this as an atheist. He had shook his fist at God for this reason. He said as an atheist that my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? The man who did this to Jackie had a different straight line than you and I do, but we think it's truly evil because there is a transcendent, objective standard, a transcendent, objective straight line. Well, what is that? That is God's holy nature. Unless there is an objective, transcendent God who establishes the standard, evil is simply a matter of opinion, and we know it's not that. So let's go back to our box for a second. I actually think that God is the best explanation for everything in the box, but I have had people say, no, evil disqualifies God. Really? They'll say, yeah, you cannot reconcile God's existence with evil. Okay, I get it. But the problem is, you think it's truly evil, and you can't get true evil unless there's an objective standard by which you're measuring, which means you'd have to have the standard that comes from God in order to complain that this happened in front of God. So it turns out without that standard, this really isn't truly evil. So evil doesn't contradict God, does not disprove God. The fact that we think that some things are truly evil proves God's existence as the standard. We simply have left to ask the question, why would he allow it? We've already talked about that. This is not an evidence against God. It's an evidence for God. Because God is the only standard that makes sense of the evil we see. You cannot have the shadow without the sunlight. The fact that you have shadow proves the sunlight. And that's the whole point. And Lewis knew this. He said, of course, I could have given up my idea of justice just by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own personal opinion. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. If there is a standard outside the room by which we define what is righteous, then it makes sense that when we see something breaks that rule, we call it evil. Now look, as we finish this, I just want to make one shameless plug for books, which I hate, because for years I was an atheist who thought that Christians only talk about these issues because they're trying to sell something. And God's sense of humor was that years later, I'm now a Christian selling books. So I just use an organization called Giving Tends to handle all my book sales. But I want you to know that we have an obligation to start talking with our young people about these issues. And I knew as I started to travel around the country that I had several layers I had to make. I've made a case for Christianity in one of our books, a case for God's existence in the book. This is chapter 8 of that second book we talked about today is chapter 8. And I also knew that as I traveled around the country, a lot of Christians were like, well, I don't need this. I was born and raised in the church, and I'm pretty comfortable that it's true. And really, look around this room right now. Look around this room right now. Where are the young people? Well, they're here. A few of them are here because you forced them to come. When you poll young people why they are leaving the church in phenomenally large numbers, Gen Z now, 3 to 18 is the largest demographic in the country. They outnumber boomers. They outnumber millennials. They outnumber Gen X. They outnumber everyone, Gen Z, 3 to 18. The absolute least religious generation in the history of our country. They've already polled them. They're already gone. And they want to know if this is true. 90% of their questions are, is this true? And tell me why it's true. So to say you were born this way, into a family that were Christians, you were raised this way, so what? You've had some religious experience that proved to you Christianity was true, so what? I've got 6 half-brothers and sisters who were all raised Mormon. You know why they believe Mormonism is true? They were raised that way. They had an experience that demonstrated the Book of Mormon was true. You don't think that's true? Yet you're using the exact same approach to your faith. We could do better than that. And they don't want my stupid books. Even though I've written much of these books for kids. We even have a kids academy where they can actually earn a certificate and have all kinds of downloadable activities. They don't want anything to do with that either. But some do. We actually post their pictures on the Honor Cadet wall if they graduate from our academy. But they don't want to hear this from me. Or any author you had up here in the last 10 weeks. They want to know if this is true from you. You can't come back and say, I've got a 23-year-old, she's no longer a Christian, can you sign this book for her? Yeah, I can do that. She's not going to read it. Those questions started at 12. That 85 at 18 rule For years, if you didn't become a Christian by the age of 18, 85% of all Christians became Christians by the age of 18. Only 15% after the age of 15 is now an 85-12. That's right, 85-12. They need us to answer their questions. So don't buy a book and give it to somebody. Learn the material. Be ready for the next conversation so you can answer their questions. Does that make sense? Let's pray. Father, we love you, and we know that this is a big responsibility for us and some tough questions. And we've already gotten some of these questions from our own kids, and we know we could probably have done a better job answering them for them. And now we know these questions are going to be even more pointed and more frequent from the next generation. So how are we going to... We need your Spirit, Father. We need your Spirit to guide us in everything. We'll pray. We'll commit to praying, Father. Would you just help us, though, to commit to study? Would you help us to see that our faith is more than just attendance? It's more than just loving. That's an important part of it. But, Father, help us to grow in the knowledge that will help the next generation. We pray this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. And everyone here says? Amen. Amen. Thanks, guys.